So far in the series, to find the cheapest budget gaming PC, we've covered our workstation conversion on the last time, and then we also covered our brand new absolute cheapest build that we could do at this point in time. So in this video, I'm going to cover what I did in my last personal budget build, and this one's going to be not nearly as cheap. I'm going to explain some of my decisions, and we'll kind of go over what you're getting for the money and then what that performance looks like. So I've got PC Part Picker up here. This is basically exactly what I purchased for my build. And some of these prices have changed drastically, so you might not at this point in time be able to exactly emulate this build. In fact, right here, right off the bat, the CPU, probably not for sale for this price. I built this right before Christmas. There's still some good sales going on. So don't take it as, you know, the other brand new build was AMD and the more expensive one is Intel. I'm not saying Intel's better than AMD. In fact, in a lot of cases, I think for the budget, it actually goes the other way. But this one was unique and on sale. So for the CPU, we went with the i5-12600K. 10-core processor. Some of those are E-cores, so you get 16 threads. And it was on sale for $140, and I was able to snag that. In gaming, between this and, you know, something on the AM4 like the 5500 and the 5600, you're not going to see much of an impact. But I just felt like that was a really good deal on the Intel 12600K. So when I went ahead and put this computer together, that was an easy choice. Wanted to try that out. And I'd been doing a lot of AMD processor builds lately, so I wanted to try the Intel out. And I'm actually filming on this computer right now, and pretty satisfied overall with it. As we go down the list here, the Thermaltake UX200, that was just, once again, what was on sale at the time. It's a standard 120 millimeter fan, tower cooler. There's always something in that about, you know, $17 to $30 range. In my experience, the performance of them all are pretty similar. There's always the ID cooling one for like $17.99. That's great for the price, and that's kind of all there is there. When you go down to the motherboard, pretty simple. Want that mid-range chipset just so I get the full options of the series, not like the real cut-down basic model. So I want the ASRock B660m. ASRock, lately I feel like their products are pretty solid. Back in the past I would have never bought them, but for a budget-minded build, I think they're a great option at this point in time. So that's all pretty standard. That's just the CPU, motherboard, everything supporting that we went into. So let's talk about what's different about this build versus my absolute cheapest build. So right here, we'll start out with the memory. So I ended up going with 32 gigs of memory, and it's a little bit faster. It's that DDR4 3600. The reason why I made this choice is if you go back and watch the video for our cheapest brand new build, the 16 gigabytes is enough for modern games, in my opinion, still. Even some of the most high-end games. It's not until you get into some extremely heavy mods or doing different things like that that really starts running out, especially if you have that 8 gigabyte video card. As we saw on the workstation conversion that only had a 4 gigabyte video card, it would sometimes exceed that, and then it would try to reserve some of your system memory to set aside for it. But the reason why I went in 32 gigs is I like to buy once, cry once. I always have a dual monitor setup. Me personally, I always like to multitask. I'm at least going to have the game open, Discord open, probably like 1 or 2 tabs of, you know, your browser of choice open. So to me, the 32 gigs is worth it, especially with just how cheap memory is. You know, I think the 16 gigs was $32. The 32 is $65. Yeah, it's a direct, you know, twice as much. But to me, $65 for 32 gigs of RAM is pretty on point. So I went ahead and made that choice to do that because I knew it was going to support my kind of play style and workflow and different things like that a little bit better. So I like to spend the money on stuff that's cheap, that's going to make a difference for me, which would be my recommendation. So if you're a kind of person that just only opens the game, has one monitor, and that's it, you might be able to get away with the 16 gigs still, but I just felt like for the money, 32 was a no-brainer. Adding $30 onto the build price for me personally was not going to make or break me. And then same thing as we go down, I'd mentioned I think both of the other budget builds had a 512 gigabyte hard drive in them. I kind of went overkill on this one. I would recommend minimum, even on a budget build, just go for the 1 terabyte drive. I personally play a lot of games, and I play a lot of large games, and I have friends that like to play totally different types of games. I can never get them all on the same page. So if I want to play with friends and different stuff, which is the whole point of, you know, why they created the internet was online gaming, then I want to be able to have the space to not in the last moment be like, oh, so-and-so hopped online and they want to play that one game, but I uninstalled it because I had to do something else. I just didn't want to mess around with that, and it's kind of on the same vein. Memory in general is just so cheap right now. I was able to pick up the Teamgroup Cardia for $84 for a 2 terabyte. That was a screaming deal to me. I think since then, those have become more and more sold out, and I think the price has risen. I think it's about $100 now. So this is kind of the importance also when you're doing the budget build, is really timing it out. You got to look for those killer sales and when they align in order to overall be able to put the thing together for a decent price. So bottom line, memory's cheap. I did the 32 gigs and I did the 2 terabyte. I think 1 terabyte would be just fine. If the $100 is going to put you out of your budget for the 2 terabyte, you can get, you know, the 1 terabyte for about $50. We move on to the video card. So I went with the PowerColor Hellhound RX6650XT 8 gig. Once again, this was right before Christmas, so the 6650s were still readily available. 6600 XTs were still readily available, and for $239, the performance of the 6650 XT is just about on par with the 7600, and the 7600 at the time was $270. So saving $30 there was a no-brainer for me. I think pretty soon, because these have been such a good value for so long now, and I think you'll notice, you'll kind of already see it happening. I think the last gen Radeon cards are going to start drying up soon. It's getting harder and harder to find 67 XTs. Their prices are actually rising. You used to be able to get them all day long for $299. Now they're going for $330. The 6650s, I think, are almost completely dried up. The 6600 XT, still a good value. You can occasionally find them, but they're not as cheap. You used to be able to pick them up for $199. Now you're looking at the non-XT version for $199, and there's a pretty significant jump. So I've seen this is where people used to recommend the 6600 XT when it was $199, and now they're all sold out, and the non-XT is $199, and people are just recommending it like it's the same card. And if you go look up the performance difference, it's pretty massive between the XT and the non-XT in the 6600 series. It's not like the 7600 and the 7600 XT where they just added on some extra VRAM and the performance is exactly the same. It's the opposite. Those cards have the same 8 gigs of VRAM, but there's a significant speed bump going up with the XT. So if you can get your hands on the XT version, I would highly suggest that. If you try to do a similar build to this and you get the non-XT, your frame rates will be what I consider significantly lower, like probably to the tune of anywhere between 10 and 30 FPS lower, depending on what title you're playing. The good news is, though, is the 7600 is already seeing price drops, especially because the new super cards are coming out. So I've seen, they were holding strong at $269, not a huge drop, but I've seen them as low as $259. At that point, we're only looking at about a $50 difference, and I'm hoping that they can continue to trend down. So as that stock dries up, hopefully enough time passes from the release of that card that it starts to get cheaper and cheaper and basically backfill that need. But performance-wise, very similar between the 6650 XT and the 7600. And then next up, the case. So the case obviously does not affect performance, But I do want to cover this one because I've seen so many people use the Montech cases on budget builds, and they do go on sale a lot. I picked this one up for $49.99. I think when it's not on sale, it's like $59.99 or something like that. But this was one thing about this case that kind of annoyed me. And it's a budget case, so I don't really have much of a leg to stand on here because it's just so cheap. But I've purchased other cases in this price range that did not do this to me. So overall, I think it looks great. It's got the tempered glass side. It's on hinges, so you can easily, like, it's just magnetic, and you can just pull it open with this little tab, service the computer, do whatever you got to do. It comes with the 3 fans in the front, 1 fan in the back. I think they show 2 fans on top, but it did not come with that. I think it's 4 fans that come pre-installed. Overall, no grommets or anything. That's pretty standard for a budget case, but it's got great, plenty of areas to route cables, do different things like that. You're just not going to have kind of like the premium feel of the grommets. It's got plenty of space to work in. Overall, not bad. And when I was building in it, I was really happy until I turned it on. And specifically because I was doing this Hellhound build and I was doing it for myself, I wanted to have that icy blue feel to it, like real frozen north type of feel. And these fans, there's only an on or off button, and they're just Molex fans. So you either get the rainbow color or you get no color. Which, once again, it's a budget case, but I've seen plenty of budget cases that have allowed you to, hold the button down to switch colors, or like at least if I could just get it in some sort of blue, or get it to switch in any way possible, or like maybe I got to spend another $10 and buy an LED controller for real cheap. I'd probably be willing to do that to fit my aesthetic, because we're doing this as a cheap build, but this is still going to be our most expensive build out of the series, and I kind of wanted it to match, my little Hellhound card, because I actually really liked the graphics and stuff on that card. So that was personally a little bit annoying to me, because the fans are rainbow. I don't want rainbow. I want icy blue. But I found that there was enough lighting in the case, so I was able to control the Thermaltake UX200, so I set that to an icy blue. Our Teamgroup RAM, I set that to icy blue. And then the motherboard has some lighting on the back and such that I set to icy blue. So what I ended up doing is I just turned the fans on the Montech off, or the LEDs on them off. They are spinning. I need the cooling. But there was enough other LEDs in there, and it actually gave it more of a subtle look. So it's not like an overpowering, super RGB gaming rig. It's just a subtle, like, hey, the CPU's ice blue, RAM's ice blue, motherboard's ice blue, and it kind of just, it's enough that it kind of just glows in the case. It doesn't really overpower you with just this like beacon of ice blue light. So it ended up coming out pretty good, but I do want to just point that out because so many people recommend these cases, and if you're like, hey, I'm really excited, this is my first build, but I'm trying to do it on a budget, and you're going for like just any amount of aesthetic, there's just not the customization there. And once again, it's a budget case. Looks like the prices are still relatively in line, about $5 more than I paid, but it's a budget case. But I've been able to purchase other cases that have that capability, and this one did not. And then finally on the list here is our power supply. So we already talked quite a bit of power supplies in our other videos. Every other build, I ended up utilizing the Thermaltake Smart Series. We talked about how, it's a pretty low reviewed power supply, and the safeties hopefully work if they're ever triggered, but it does have a lot of fluctuation in power and a hard time controlling exactly what you want. So in this build, I went for peace of mind, and it is about twice the price, but we're still well under $100 here. We're looking at the Corsair unit. I've used Corsair power supplies in quite a few of my higher performance builds. I've always been satisfied with them. This one is gold rated, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's a high quality. It just means that it met the certification standards, but Corsair is pretty reputable with that gold standard, I'm pretty confident that that's going to be a nicer power supply by far than those Smart Series. So overall, what we're looking at is the total price is just under $800. So this is clearly a totally different range than the other computers we've built so far. So the workstation conversion was about, I think $180, $190 if you were to buy it all yourself. I had about $60 invested because I had some parts laying around, and our brand new build was like $399. So clearly this is a totally different tier of computer, but I wanted to at least have this as a reference point because I think this is more in line with what most people recommend for, like, hey, I'm trying to do a relatively cheap computer. And not to spoil anything, but what we're going to find is, especially at 1080p, this is going to run anything you want to run. It's going to have much better performance on the new releases. It's going to absolutely destroy esports games, any indie games, things like that. But it's still good to have this as a reference point. So it's like, hey, do I want to spend, the $700 to $800? Or if I'm really tight on my budget, are those other options we looked at going to suffice for me? And there's definitely some extras that I put in here. Like, you could whittle that down. Like we already talked about, you don't necessarily need 2 terabytes. You could do 1. You could still get away with the 16 gigs at this point. And then you're probably not going to get this deal on the processor. So ultimately, this thing's probably going to switch to AMD, which might save you a couple of bucks too if you do like the 5600 while it's on sale. So you could probably definitely get this down to $700, maybe even into the high sixes. But this is just my personal build that I went ahead and did. So I'm using it as a baseline of like, hey, this is what a lot of people recommend, and can you get away with those other cheaper builds? So with that, we're going to go right into looking at our actual benchmark tests, and then we'll kind of summarize the performance at the end.
The wrong day to screw with us. Go fuck yourselves.
marked. You're cleared hot. With you, mate.
Now that we've seen the actual rig in action, let's kind of go over the base numbers here, look at how it fell out overall. So right out of the gate, first thing we're going to look at, Alan Wake 2. So as you can see, we've jumped up in tier in the price range, and now we've got the full gambit of availability of settings versus how we want our experience to be. So if you remember on the workstation build, we actually were able to run Alan Wake 2, although it was going to need to be low settings and limited frame rates. On our brand new build, actually, because we went with the RX580 for that $88, that is an aging architecture on that card. So unfortunately, it was unable. This was, I think, the only test it was unable to run. But it was unable to complete or run Alan Wake 2 at all. And now we're on to our i5 and 6650XT build. You can see as we go down the numbers here, on the lowest settings with FSRQs, is probably not how I personally play the game, but I just want to have comparison to our other builds. The average was 84 FPS with a 1% low at 45. Once we come down to the lowest settings, we're average of 58, just shy of that 60 FPS mark with our 1% low at 31. Medium is going to be 50 on average, 27 on the 1% low. And then highest, not too big of a fall off there, 47 on the average, 26 on the 1% low. So this is a great place to be in because this is a very slow-paced, single-player, meant to be experienced type game. So if you are all in on the visuals and you just want to have that experience, I think it's definitely going to be playable on this rig. And keep in mind, this is probably the most challenging game to run that's out right now. So highest settings, you're still going to be about 47 FPS on average. And I went ahead and ran around in the game with those settings. Definitely playable. You could do that. Or if it really bugs you to be a little bit on the lower end of FPS, you could start lowering them down. Definitely get to around that 60 FPS or even higher if you implement upscaling. In reality, most of these newer games respond very well to upscaling, so I didn't go through and wasn't able to test every single configuration, but probably even on the highest, if you put that FSR with quality on, you'd probably get up pretty damn close to that 60 FPS, and that'd probably be the sweet spot for performance. So you go into Resident Evil 4 for all systems. I only tested medium. This one I ended up adding in highest just because I felt like it did have the capability, and for that game, it's quite honestly probably where you'd be looking at. So for medium FSR quality, average is 159, 110. There's just no reason to have FPS that high in a single-player game like this, especially it's like survival horror. And then everything, once again, the mobs kind of just ramble at you. Nothing's really all that fast-paced. Medium's going to get you 137 on the average, 99 on the 1% low, and then highest 100 on average, 82 on the 1% low. Now, I will say this is still an 8GB card. We're still testing 1080p, but even on the highest settings, it did give me a warning that VRAM was going to be a problem, and we were potentially busting over our available VRAM. However, in testing, I think that might be a difference of just how it's allocating versus actually dedicating VRAM, because as you can see, we're still well over 100 FPS on average, and 82 is pretty tight on the 1% low. I was not seeing big performance problems there with that, and that is a game where there's not really preset settings. There's just a lot of settings, so you could probably tweak it a little bit if you were concerned about that VRAM. But this was the title. I knew VRAM would give 8GB cards problems on. But overall, I think it's just pretty well optimized, because even all the way down to the 4GB card, that should have severely limited it. The performance was still pretty good and playable all around, but definitely much higher on this build compared to our cheaper builds. The Last of Us Part 1, I went ahead and tested all the same profiles we did in the other games because I knew they were going to struggle with it. So we have the lowest plus FSR, sorry about that. It's going to be 145 on average, 100 on the 1% low. Lowest with the upscaling off is going to be 131 on average with 106 and 1% low. Low is going to be 129, 102. Once again, this is a slow-paced single-player game. I'm probably going to prioritize graphics because, as you can see on medium, the average is 102 with 1% low at 89 if you like that higher FPS experience. Or we can crank it all the way up. The highest settings are 64 on the average, 55 on the 1% low. Then we go down to Cyberpunk. I did not test any sort of ray tracing on this card. The 6650 is the one card out of the 3 computers that we're trying out in this run that is ray tracing capable. But my personal opinion on the ray tracing is at this budget, you're just going to have a better experience, and you're probably not going to notice. You're going to feel much better with smooth gameplay and ray tracing off than really choppy gameplay and ray tracing on. And even you could say, well, we could have gone NVIDIA, sure, but even 4060 is going to struggle with ray tracing. Is it much better than AMD? Yes, but I'd still say if we're looking at this like sub, $800 build, we should just focus on having a really good playable experience with higher textures, because ultimately that's going to be more pleasing to the eye than extra lighting effects, in my opinion. So as we go through Cyberpunk, lowest plus upscaling is going to be 163 on average, 118 on the 1% low. Low is going to be 132 on average, 104 on the 1% low. Medium is going to be 102 with 82 on the 1% low. And then even at Ultra is still playable with that ray tracing off. So everything else is cranked up, but you're looking at rasterized performance. You're going to be 73 on the average, 56 on the 1% low, and that's going to be a great experience. We come down to Forza. I did not end up testing on this one the lowest and low settings just because the performance was already climbing through the roof, and I wanted to move on to other tests. So when we look at medium, you're already 192 on average, 144 on the 1% low, and then on extreme, 95 average, 78 on the 1% low. So that's how I personally would probably play this game. 95 FPS is more than enough for a racing game, and it's going to look great with the options cranked up all the way to the extreme. Fortnite, this is where we ran into problems with our workstation build just because the processor was a little bit older and it was having a rough time trying to keep up with the large battle royale game. Now that we've moved up to the i5 12600, that's no longer a problem. So on the lowest settings, you're at 224 on the average, 148 on the 1% low, and then on medium, 190 with 85 on the 1% low. And for this game, because it's competitive, I would just choose the graphics based off of how many hertz my monitor was. So if I'm rocking a 144 hertz monitor, I probably honestly would continue to increase the graphics because we're already way above what we can display there. Valorant, I have a lot of opinions on the game of Valorant, but basically I did not test on this PC because if you have Windows 10, you can play Valorant. If you do a fresh install of Windows 11, you can play Valorant. But apparently the anti-cheat has a problem in this game if you were on Windows 10 and you upgraded to Windows 11. So every time I tried to load into this game, it would not allow me to play because it said I was cheating because of my operating system, which is absolutely ridiculous. But regardless, as we saw in the other builds, usually Valorant on the highest settings ran about the equivalent of Counter-Strike on the lowest settings. So I'm confident this build would be, depending on the environment, probably about somewhere between 300 and 500 FPS. So bottom line, for any monitor that you could possibly own, you're not going to have a problem playing Valorant on this. Next one up, looking at Counter-Strike. Similar thing here. You're going to be playing on the highest settings, no problems, because you're just not probably going to have a monitor that can support anything else, because, there's nothing out there that's 500 hertz hardly that your budget gamer is going to be purchasing for an $800 computer. So CS2 on low, just to go over the numbers, you got 497 on the average, 250 on the 1% low. On medium, you've got 467 on the average, 239 on the 1% low, and then even on the highest settings, you're looking at 275 with 213 on the 1% low. And then as we go into Modern Warfare 3, once again, I included it just for fun. This is not how I'd suggest playing this game, but they did implement FSR 3 in this game, so we went ahead and did the minimum settings plus the frame generation just to see how it performed. Got us to 312 with average with 1% at 189. And then we come back, start scaling it back, turn the frame gen off. That drops it to 205 on average, 137 on the 1% low. And then with no upscaling, you're looking at 204 with 135 on the 1% low. So almost no difference there on the minimum settings. And then this thing's running fast enough. I don't really think upscaling at 1080p would be necessary at all. And you're probably looking at just increasing those graphics to then match your FPS more closely with the hertz of your monitor. So once we go into balance, you're looking at 172 on average with 116 the 1% low, and then even on extreme, the highest settings, you're looking at 114 on average with 63 on the 1% low. So this is a competitive game. If you're rocking a 144 hertz monitor, I'd probably run balanced with your FreeSync on, and then set it up however you'd like. But on the 172 average with 116, I think that's going to give you a very good experience. And it's those balanced settings. The game's still going to look good, but you're going to have enough FPS to be able to play as competitively as you are able. So overall, that's how the numbers fell out on this build. I was pretty satisfied. I think it shouldn't be a shock to anybody that this performed better than our previous two builds, because it's anywhere from double to 4 times as much the price. But this is looking at more in line with current generation tech. I know there's newer generation stuff out there, but this is what I would consider, like current-ish generation stuff. We're looking at this, this generation's platform for the motherboard, and this is a 66 versus 76, but the performance is almost exactly the same. So shouldn't have been a shock, but this will run any game you want to. Even the newest AAA titles. Did not go ahead and go through with the ray tracing test just because there's no other computer in our lineup that we're going to compare that can do ray tracing, and I don't think it's going to be surprising when a entry-level last-gen budget card does not perform well at ray tracing, and that really should just not be your focus when you're looking in this this cost category. So now we've reviewed our i5-12600 with the 6600 XT. We've now completed all 3 of the budget builds that I set out to do. The workstation conversion, the cheapest brand new budget build, and then this is kind of my, what I'll call Gucci budget build with some of my extras in there. And we've looked at all their performance individually. So that's going to conclude kind of what we're going to look at today. But in the next video there, we're going to summarize it all up and look at the performance against each other, and then their overall cost, and kind of look at what are the pros, cons, what are you giving up at each price bracket or gaining at each price bracket, and then ultimately just, which build had the lowest, cost per frame. And we'll be tackling that here in the next few days. So look forward to that one. Go ahead, subscribe, and you'll get that notification when it comes out. Thanks.